This episode brought to you by MeepleRealty.com, your source for high-quality custom board game inserts. Meeple Realty, think inside the box. Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today I'm bringing you something I'm very excited about, which is the how to play Atlantis Rising. Now this is a game that came onto my radar back in 2012, right after I first got into gaming. However, shortly after I became aware of the game, it went out of print, has been incredibly expensive, and I really was just assuming I never would get to play the game, or if I did get to play it, you know, maybe it'd be at a con or something like that. However, thanks to Colin over at One Stop Co-op Shop, which is a great YouTube channel, y'all should check it out if you haven't seen it yet. We're basically doing a sort of board game exchange. So he has sent me Atlantis Rising. I'll be sending him, I believe Tavarua next is the one that he has chosen. When I send Atlantis Rising back to him, he'll get Tavarua and he'll do a series over there on that game. And we're going to do this back and forth every couple of months or so. Very exciting to get more into that. But right now, let's get into Atlantis Rising, a cooperative game where you were basically trying to move the island of Atlantis before its destruction is complete. So let's see how you play. First, set up the island of Atlantis by laying the tiles out like this. You'll notice that the tiles actually do have connecting pieces here to make the artwork flow together. That's not necessary for mechanical reasons in the game, however, it certainly does make the board flow better. The resources in the game are ore, Atlantium, gold, and crystal. Place each of the four resources within reach of the players, and I prefer to place them next to the respective areas they can be gathered on the board. Also place the mystic energy beads, mystic barriers, courage tokens, and production dice within reach of the players. Shuffle the Misfortune deck and the knowledge deck and place them both within reach of the players. Players win by building all 10 components of the cosmic gate before the island completely sinks. However, the blueprint for that cosmic gate changes from game to game. So the next step of the setup is to create the blueprint for the cosmic gate by using these decks of cards. Component cards are labeled in different groups, A, B, C, and D. It's recommended that for the first game, players don't use the D deck at all. Players should then randomly select 3 cards from the A deck, 3 cards from the B deck, and 3 cards from the C deck. The 10th component is always the Power Core card, which has this white dot on the back. Place all 10 component cards in an area easily visible by all players, and place the unused component cards back in the box. Each player then selects a counselor, in this case the astrologer and the scholar, and places the remaining counselors back in the box. Each player then takes 3 Atlanteans of the color of their counselor. These Atlanteans represent the counselor's loyal followers. Each player also takes 1 mystic energy. Place the remaining Atlanteans of the selected color nearby in a supply pile. Also included in that supply pile are the gray Atlanteans. Any Atlanteans of unused colors are placed back in the box. Place the Atlantean Navy board in the play area and place the Athenian galley over the dot corresponding with the number of players. In this case, we're setting up for a 2-player game, so the galley will go here. However, if we were setting up for a 4 or more player game, it would start here. Also, place the attack die nearby. The player who went swimming most recently is the first player and takes the first player token. Atlantis Rising is a fully cooperative game, which means all players will either share in the victory if they build the cosmic gate, or share in the defeat if the island sinks beneath the waves. The game is played over the course of multiple turns, and each turn is broken into 5 phases. Just for reference, at the bottom of the character card, the player has the phases listed, as you can see here. Those phases are place Atlanteans, draw Misfortunes, productive actions, Athenians attack, and build components. Before beginning the first phase of her turn, a player may use her counselor's ability, if appropriate, or play knowledge cards. The first player will begin the round by placing all of her workers on either the island or the navy, or putting some on each. Play will then continue to the next player to the left, and will continue this way until all players have placed all of their Atlanteans. Each island tile can support up to a specific number of workers. For instance, these 3 tiles can support 3 workers each, these 2 can support up to 2 workers, and this tile can support only 1 worker. Each worker placed on a tile must be placed inside one of the rings. If no rings are open, then a worker may not be placed on that tile and must be placed on a different tile. Atlanteans of different colors may share the same tile as long as the maximum number allowed is not exceeded. The center tile may hold an unlimited number of workers, and the same is true for the Atlantean Navy. The second phase is the Draw Misfortunes phase. Beginning with the starting player and proceeding clockwise, each player draws and then resolves a misfortune card. If a misfortune card requires a decision, such as Controlled Flood, all players may discuss what to do, but the current player has the final say. If a tile floods while an Atlantean is on it, then that worker is returned to its owner and the tile is flipped. Keep in mind that that worker was not able to complete its productive action because the tile floods prior to the third phase. Tiles will always flood starting at the tip of an island spur and moving inward. Most misfortune cards are basic flood cards like these. Basic flood cards state flood and then tell the player which section to flood. When a player reveals a basic flood card, she must flip over the next unflooded section on the island of the named section. If the section to be flooded is already completely flooded, as you see the cities are here, then the player must choose any 2 unflooded tiles to flip. For instance, the forge and the libraries. Players are not required to flip 2 different sets of tiles, so I could have in fact left the libraries unflipped and flipped 2 forge tiles instead. And of course, if all island tiles are flooded, the players lose the game. Basic flood cards may be canceled by discarding 3 Mystic Energy. Multiple players may donate Mystic Energy to cancel a basic flood card. Some misfortune cards, such as Lack of Support and Controlled Flood, are special misfortunes. These can never be prevented by Mystic Energy. Each special misfortune card will have specific instructions on how to resolve it. When Spur the Cycle is drawn, shuffle the discard pile, including Spur the Cycle, back into the main deck. If any game effect would allow a player to discard Spur the Cycle, the effect of Spur the Cycle still triggers. Once each player has resolved their misfortune card, the next phase is the productive actions phase. Starting with the first player, each player will resolve all of her productive actions that still have Atlanteans on them. The player may do this in whatever order she wishes. Once a productive action is performed, the player removes the Atlantean from the board and places it back in her personal supply. Let's discuss each of the possible productive actions a player's Atlanteans may take. The player can mine the mountains for ore. The player rolls 1 white production die for each Atlantean placed here. If the player rolls equal to or higher than the target number printed on the tile, then the roll is a success. Certain effects may allow the player to raise or lower the target number of a tile. No matter the effect, the target number may never be raised above 6 or below 2. After the production die is rolled, the player may spend mystic energy to raise the value of the result by 1. A player may spend as much energy in this way as she wants. However, other players may not spend their mystic energy to raise the current player's roll. Once all effects are resolved, if the roll was a success, the player removes their Atlantean and gathers the resource. The hills and forests behave in exactly the same way as the mountains, except in the hills, players will earn gold, and in the forest, players will earn crystal. You'll also notice that the hills are slightly more difficult to succeed in than the mountains, and the forest are slightly more difficult to succeed in than the hills. For each Atlantean a player places on the library tile, she draws and keeps a number of knowledge cards as shown on the tile. For instance, the red player would get to draw 2 and keep 2 of the knowledge cards. Meanwhile, the green player gets to draw 2 and keep 1 of the knowledge cards. All players have a maximum hand limit of 4 knowledge cards. If a player ever finds that she has more than 4 cards, she needs to immediately discard or play knowledge cards until she's down to 4. For each Atlantean placed on a forge tile, the player may transmute 1 ore into 1 or more Atlanteum. For instance, the green player would transmute this 1 ore into 3 Atlanteum, while the red player would transmute the 1 ore into 2 Atlanteum. It's important to note that each worker placed on this tile can only transmute a single ore. So if a player wants to transmute more than 1 ore, she'll have to place more than 1 worker. A player may gain additional Atlanteans by placing workers on these city tiles. Only one player may use a city tile at a time. Having 2 different color Atlanteans on a city tile will result in no one receiving the new worker from this tile. So for this tile, it only requires 1 worker to then gain an additional worker. Whereas on this tile, the red player has to use 2 workers to gain 1. If instead the red and the green had for some reason both placed workers on this tile, nothing would come from that result. The final possible tile a player may use during the productive action phase is the mystic power source. Each Atlantean placed here gains the player 1 mystic energy. Each Atlantean placed here gains the player 1 mystic energy. As stated before, any number of Atlanteans may be placed on the mystic power source. So what exactly does the mystic energy do? We've already discussed how a player may discard a mystic energy to increase her roll by 1 on the production die, and that other players may not assist a player in doing so. We already discussed that multiple players may discard 3 mystic energy to cancel a basic flood card. A single player may spend 2 of her mystic energy to transmute any resource cube into any other resource cube. However, just like with the production die rolls, other players may not assist a player in doing this. And the final thing players may use mystic energy for is multiple players may discard 5 mystic energy to unflood a flooded tile. Once the productive actions phase is completed, players will need to weather a potentially brutal assault from the Athenian navy. In the 4th phase, Athenians attack. The starting player will roll the black attack die, add the result to the number indicated on the attack track, in this case 0, and compare that result to the number of Atlanteans placed in the Atlantean navy. Now you can see here that for some reason no Atlanteans were placed, so this 3 would be the end result. However, let's say that this is what was placed there, 3 total Atlanteans against the 3 attack from the Athenians. If the number of Atlanteans is equal to or greater than the attack value of the Athenians, as it is here, then nothing happens. However, if the number of Atlanteans is less than the attack value of the Athenians, the player must sink 1 tile for each Atlantean they were lacking. So in this case, 4 plus 0 is 4 for the attack value. There's 3 Atlanteans, so the players will have to choose one tile to sink. The tiles may come from any branch of the island, but as usual, must be the farthest from the center of the island on that particular branch. If the players cannot reach a consensus on which tiles to flip, the starting player has final decision. Once the Athenian attack phase has been resolved, advance the Athenian galley one step on the attack track. Keep in mind, the galley has a maximum distance it can travel on the track in a game based on the number of players. For example, in a 2-player game, the galley will never go past 5. In a 3-player game, 8. And in a 4 and more player game, 12. Also, if a player has contributed at least 2 Atlanteans to the Navy and has contributed the most to the Navy this turn as well, then that player receives a courage token. For instance here, the green player has contributed 2 Atlanteans and clearly has contributed more than the red player, and so the green player will earn a courage token. If 2 players are tied for the most, as you see here, then the first player in turn order will receive the courage token. No matter what the situation, only 1 player at most may receive a courage token in this fashion per turn. We'll discuss what courage tokens are used for in more detail shortly. The final phase of each round is the build components phase. Each player has 2 options in this phase. If she has the correct combination of resources, a player may build 1 and only 1 component during this phase. Otherwise, that player must pass. Each component also provides an additional benefit which is detailed on the card. This benefit is gained only once and is gained immediately upon building the component. So if a player had the crystal and the Atlanteum to build the stabilizer, the player would then look at the top card of the Misfortune deck and either discard it or place it back on top of the deck. Once the effect of the component is resolved, the card is taken by the player who built it. Certain in-game effects may reduce the number of resources that are required to build a component. However, no matter what these effects are, the minimum number of resources is always 1. A player cannot build a component for free. Also, it's important to note that players may not trade the resources that they have amongst each other unless a specific effect allows them to do so. At the end of each round, the current starting player passes the start player token to the player on her left. Knowledge cards can be played at any time. However, they may never be used to interrupt an action. For instance, a Science of Shielding card may be played in reaction to a Flood Forge's Misfortune card, but the Misfortune would take effect before the Mystic Barrier token was placed. Which means if a player drew the Flood Forest card, they could not then immediately play Science of Shielding to shield the outermost tile from being flooded. That tile would get flooded first, and then Science of Shielding could be played on the next tile up to be flooded. As we've previously discussed, each player has a maximum hand limit of 4 knowledge cards, and she must either discard or play cards to get back down to 4 if she ever has more than that limit. When a player gains courage tokens, she may store them for as long as she likes before using them. When placing Atlanteans on the board or in the Navy, a player may place a courage token underneath that worker. At most, each worker can have 1 courage token underneath them. If a tile to be flooded contains an Atlantean with a courage token, the token is expended and the Atlantean may perform the productive action of that tile immediately before returning to the player's personal supply. On the other hand, if that same tile escapes Misfortune, the courage token goes back to the player and may be used later. An Atlantean placed in the Navy with a courage token counts as 2 Atlanteans instead of 1 when determining the result of the Athenians' attack phase. In this case, the courage token is always lost regardless of the outcome of the battle. It's also important to note that the worker does not count as 2 workers for the purpose of determining which player supplied the most workers to the Navy. During the course of the game, players may gain access to Mystic Barrier tokens. Once gained, Mystic Barriers may be placed on any tile on the island. If a basic flood misfortune would flood a tile with a Mystic Barrier, instead the player discards the Mystic Barrier and the tile remains intact. It's very important to remember this only works against basic flood misfortunes. Also note that each tile may only support up to one Mystic Barrier at a time. When unflooding tiles, players always flip them from the innermost flooded tile outward. Resource cubes should be considered to be in an unlimited supply. If the players ever find they have run out of a resource cube and need more, they should find a suitable substitute or track it in some other way. Also, if the knowledge deck ever runs out, simply reshuffle the discard pile to form a new knowledge deck. And that's how you play Atlantis Rising. There are rules for advanced play on page 10 and an FAQ on page 11, but I'll leave those for you to find on your own. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you like my channel, please subscribe. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.